11. It was a long 6 days. The first few had gone off without a hitch. But then, in the middle of the night, 3 days in, the tunnel alignment had lost its cohesion, and the ship had dropped out of the undercurrent before anyone could stabilize it, which meant they had to start over and initialize it again. It gave Cas a new appreciation for just how much work Sesster had done to keep the ship moving at all costs. Manually adjusting the outputs proved to not only be difficult, but tedious, and on more than one occasion he was called back down to engineering to adjust some of the emitters, so it didn't fail again. But the real victory had been that each day Cas had become more and more confident Evie's memories would stay blocked. She was showing no signs of relapse, and most of the crew had reintegrated without causing any issues or any questions being raised about what had happened down on the planet. Cas realized if Evie couldn't remember the incident, Raffenkel was going to have a hard time convincing anyone else of what she'd done. Even Cas could claim ignorance, having been too far away to have witnessed anything at the time. It was all working out as well as he could hope, and the box in the back of his mind had quieted, almost to the point that he forgot it was there. Cas stepped onto the bridge just as first shift was getting started. 2 days prior, Zoll had returned to his station, Dr. Amargosa having completely rebuilt his mechanical suit from scratch, hollow projectors and all. Cas had been to visit him once, when he was still in his natural form, though they hadn't been able to communicate. He'd just sat in Zoll's quarters while Zoll skidded around the track he'd built around the ceiling of his room. And though they couldn't communicate, Cas felt like Zoll had appreciated the company. But this morning he seemed to be back to his normal self, with a brand new set of royal blue robes and honoring of Kor, the Everlasting. The only difference was the holographic projection of his face wasn't quite the same as it had been before. The face was older, wizened, and Cas wasn't sure if Zoll had made that choice, or it was something Amargosa had done for him. Lieutenant Rond and Ensign River sat at their stations, staring straight ahead at the green-tinged tunnel of the undercurrent as it sped by them, punctuated by brief flashes as they entered and exited microholes created by Zenforce technology. Wolf sat at the bridge engineering station, focused on her work, while Ensign Talia had taken the tactical position. She sat back with an ease about her, as if the prospect of returning home was boring. Evie sat in the captain's chair, focused on a report in front of her, as Cas rounded his own chair and sat beside her. "Big day," he said. Her attention had been enslaved by whatever she was reading. "For a while there, I never thought it would happen." He allowed the silence to stretch between them, until she finally glanced up. "What?" "I said, for a while, I never thought this day would come." She may not be in any kind of relapse, but he had noticed Evie'd had difficulty focusing over the past few days. It was hard to tell if it was because of the surgery or something else. If this was the price they'd had to pay, it might just be worth it. "Right, yeah. I was just going over our comm blasts." She tapped her screen, and the report slid over to Cas's chair. "None of our hails have been answered, and we can tell just by the radiation. Half of the messages never even reached their intended targets. Or if they did, they slid right past and kept on going into deep space. Which means they probably aren't there to receive them." She nodded, checking the time. "Navigation, how close?" River turned to look at them. "Another 5 minutes until we're within range of Starbase 5, if we maintain current speed." Cas didn't say what all of them must be thinking. There was no guarantee the station would still even be there. Instead, he focused on how best to be prepared when they arrived. "Ensign, what is our weapons status?" he asked Talia. She straightened, uncrossing her arms and tapping a few buttons on the console before her. "All blade emitters are charged, all dart housings are loaded, and the armor is at full capacity. Zenfor gave me a rundown of all the new upgrades, and I think we're as ready as we can be. It remains to be seen if we can penetrate enemy defenses." Cas turned to Zoll. "Anything yet?" "Nothing, Commander." Despite the change in his face, his voice was still that ever-chilling bass-laden speech, the voice of death himself. All attempts to communicate have not been successful. Cas settled into his chair. Engines? Wolf shrugged. As good as they can be. But if we encounter an armada there, I don't see how we'll get away in time, especially if we have to restart manually again. She was right. Even if they emerged and found nothing, the Athru could be out there hiding in their time bubbles, invisible from all their scanners. They could be watching them as they headed there now, lying in wait. The only advantage Tempest seemed to have over the Athru was its speed. But if it took forever to engage the engines... Coming up on the station, Ron said. Drop out of the undercurrent. As soon as we're clear, raise all the armor, Evie said. Cas couldn't help but feel the hammering of his heart in his chest. Would they even recognize the Coalition? Was there anything left? They'd been gone longer than half the time he'd been alive. And if there wasn't anything left, what would they do after this? The tunnel around them dissipated as Tempest re-entered normal space, the stars becoming flecks of white paint against the black canvas. It's there, someone yelled, though Cas wasn't sure who. His attention was too focused on the station in front of them. Almost a copy of Starbase 8, 5 held an hourglass shape, where it was wide at both ends and tapered in the middle. One end would be the interior shipyards, complete with any repair facilities any passing Coalition ships might need, while the other end was the habitable ring, which included shops, living quarters, and offices. Most of the cargo was stored in modular units that could be attached to many different parts on the outside of the station. Starbase 5 sat in front of them, gleaming gray and white, but there was something wrong. The station wasn't generating any power signatures, and there were no lights to illuminate it. As the station rotated in front of them, Cas saw why. The backside, which had been impossible to see when they'd come out of the undercurrent, had been virtually destroyed, as if something had cleaved the station lengthwise, cutting it in half. And where the other half of the station should be was nothing but free-floating debris, locked in an eternal orbit with the intact part of the station. Parts of ships that had been inside the shipyards when the entire station had been decompressed. By Cor! Talia leaned forward on her console. The debris had formed something of a ring after years and years of gravitational pull. Scanners, Evie said. I want to know if there was anyone alive over there. Everyone was silent as the computer did its job. No life signs detected, Zal replied. Though I am picking up over 7,000 bodies. No power sources either. Carbon decay estimates the station has been in this state for approximately 18 years. They did it, Talia said. They did it. Just came through and destroyed it all. Evie rubbed her temples with both hands. Any indication of hostile ships? Nothing as far as I can detect, Zal replied, though they could be hiding. They all stared at the screen, waiting for someone to say something. Waiting, Cas thought, for someone to wake them all up. Even though he wasn't part of the Coalition anymore, this still hit him hard. But not as hard as it probably hit River, Rond, and some of the others. People who had dedicated their lives to the cause, only to see this first indication that there might not be a cause left. He tried to imagine how he would have reacted as an ensign or junior lieutenant fresh on his first assignment to this news. In his opinion, they were all holding it together better than he would have. What about the station's computer? Can we download its logs? Zal shook his holographic head. Without a power source, we can't connect. We'd have to send someone over with a converter, start up the main computer, then we could download their entire database. Any non-Coalition bodies in that group, Zal? Cas asked, trying his best to be tactful. But how did someone ask a question like that? This was one instance where he wanted Laska around. She'd have a diplomatic way of handling all of this. 2 Calgarians, 1 Erustian. All could have been diplomatic envoys. No Athru bodies, Cas thought. Which meant they caught them by surprise, and it was quick. And they never came back to clean up the mess. Why would they? Space was big. It wasn't like they needed to make sure everyone was dead. Anyone who didn't die in the initial attack most likely died from suffocation or starvation a few days later, especially if all the ships and shuttles had been damaged or destroyed. Before we press on any further, I want as much information as we can get, Evie said. We'll need to send a team over there to power up the computer so we can at least get the last bit of sensor data. It might tell us something important. I'll do it, Cas said, staring straight ahead. Even though she was to his back, he could feel Wolf's gaze on him. But he didn't turn around. I'll take a small team. It won't take long. Cas caught a hint of concern in Evie's eyes when he finally looked at her, but she nodded anyway. Get it done and back quick. We can't afford to lose anyone else. Cas stood. He had no intention of being lost. Why is it every time you need a pilot, you volunteer me? Jan said at the helm of the small ship, using it to swerve around and through the debris field. Not all the flotsam had coagulated into the ring, and there were tiny pieces of bulkheads and pipes everywhere, not to mention the globs of spilled liquid. And the bodies. Most were in uniform, but there were those who had on few clothes, if any, as if they'd been blown into open space in the middle of their morning routines, or while they slept. It chilled Cas to the core. You're the best pilot I know, and that includes Box, Cas said, averting his eyes from the windscreen. Just don't let him hear you say that, Ryan said beside him. He'd chosen both of them, in addition to Ensign Talia, because he knew he could trust all three of them. Box had wanted to go, to provide medical assistance if necessary, which it wouldn't be. But a mission such as this needed less bravado, more subtlety, and Box was the least subtle person Cas knew. Let's just hope this goes better than last time, Jan said. I don't want a repeat of old Deadeye back there's sickbay visit. She motioned toward Ryan, who shot her a nasty look. Talia creased her brow. What happened in sickbay? Had to pump his stomach. Pulled out about a liter of this black sludge. I still can't believe you drank that stuff. She turned back around and course-corrected to avoid the back half of a sonic generator. Had to, Ryan said, defiant. Otherwise, that bastard never would have talked to us, right? His questioning glance was directed at Cas. I still don't know if he was testing us somehow. Fortunately, he cut his eyes to Jan. Fortunately, my body didn't have any problem digesting it. Though I don't think I drank as much as you. Yeah, you and the lieutenant were fine, Ryan said, and Cas cringed. Even though Evie wasn't here, he just wished everyone would never mention anything relating to Laura again. What if Talia got curious and asked Evie how Laura had handled it? He needed to get the focus off this subject. How much farther? Cas asked. A few 100 meters. The deeper in we go, the denser the debris. Jan maneuvered the shuttle again to avoid pieces of bulkhead frozen in place. Everyone get into your envirosuits, Cas said. No atmosphere and no gravity mean we'll have to do this the old-fashioned way. No need, Talia said, holding out 3 small oval-shaped units. These are modified versions of Vreeja's suit he wore on the outside of our ship. Wolf gave them to me. He had time to develop these while we were gone. They have their own small gravity generators and enough air to last 6 hours. Cas took one, examining it. It resembled the device Vreej had used in the past, but it was more compact. If he didn't know better, he'd say Zenfor helped Vreej modify his own technology. It would certainly make interacting with the environment easier. 6 hours? That's what she told me. Cas clipped the device to his belt and activated it. For one brief second, he felt a rush of air, then a warmth over his whole body. It was like the repel fields he'd used in the past, but more intense, like being wrapped in a protective cocoon. Talia and Ryan did the same, while Cas gave the last one to Jan, who sat it on the empty seat beside her. "I'll deal with it once I'm sure we're down in one piece," she said, swinging around a tangled mess of cable and conduit. Finally, Cas could see an opening ahead of them. What seemed to be the part of the station's promenade that hadn't been shorn off. All the glass in the ceiling was missing, and anything not bolted down had long since blown out into space. But the layout was immediately familiar to him. Jan set the shuttle down right in the middle of the concourse, using the maglock to keep the shuttle from floating away. While Cas and the others fit themselves with flashlights and weapons, Jan activated her own field, clipping it to her belt as well. "Everyone ready?" Cas asked as they all double-checked their persons. "Remember, all we need to do is connect this power source." He held up a portable power unit to the nearest station terminal and power it up so Tempest can download the files. But we have to make sure to use the proprietary secure coalition network, not the same one all the merchants down here would be on. Everyone keep an open comm, because once we're out there, we won't be able to hear a thing. They all nodded, tapping the backs of their hands. "Ready when you are, Captain." Cas winked at Jan. A smile tugged at her mouth, and she activated the force barrier at the end of the shuttle, then opened the loading bay door. Talia and Ryan went first, their weapons out in front of them as they scanned the dark promenade for anything unusual. Cas and Jan followed. He wasn't expecting to find anything hostile here, but it was better to be prepared than not, and they still weren't sure of all the Authu's capabilities yet. For all he knew, they could camouflage their bodies and keep them from sensors. "I've got nothing," Talia said through his comm piece. "Heading up to the officers' levels." She led the way to the nearest access corridor. Without power, none of the hypervators would work, so they'd have to make the climb by hand. Cas had wished they could have landed closer, but without the docking latches working, the promenade was the only place large enough for the shuttle. The further into the station they traveled, the more Cas relaxed. He'd expected the opposite, but there was no reason for the Authu to station spies here 18 years after their invasion. They'd accomplished their goal. It was possible they might have even moved on to their next target, millions of light years away. They might have just attacked the Coalition because it was in their way, like with the Bulak. "Hold up here," Talia said, as soon as they reached the officer's level. She crept ahead of them, her light disappearing as the walls curved to the left. Cas recognized the decoration in the dark corridors. It was the same as the way to Admiral Sangby's office had been. They wouldn't be far now. All they needed to do was get in one of these rooms and boot the closest terminal. "Okay," Talia said, after jogging back from the far end of the corridor. "Just wanted to make sure. Any of these should do." Cas nodded to the closest door, which, according to the sign, had been the office of a Commodore Peter Richmond. Cas had never heard the name before, but the Commodore was going to perform one last service for the Coalition, even if he didn't know it. Cas and Ryan got on either side of the door and pulled at the sliding frames. It took more power than Cas realized, but once he got his fingers around the edge, he managed to wrench the door open. When he looked up to see if Ryan had managed his side, the corridor was filled with a bright light that nearly blinded him, and he had to throw his arm over his eyes. "What the fuck?" Ryan and Jan both yelled something, but their words were cut off. When Cas dropped his arm, he realized he was staring right down the end of a pulse rifle. 12. No one move. Cas stared at the opaque bubble atop the head of the being standing in front of him, but he couldn't see their face. All he knew was there were 6 of them, they all had guns pointed at his team, and they spoke Universal Standard. Cas glanced to the others. Without the heavy envirosuits on, it was easy to read their body language, and they'd all been caught by surprise. By the grimace on her face, Talia seemed furious, probably because she'd given them the all-clear. "Name, rank, and purpose," one of the masked beings said, indicating Cas with his weapon. Cas didn't think he was an Authu. His body wouldn't have fit so well in the suit. He could be any one of the humanoid species of the Coalition, or even those outside it. There was no telling. They needed to let Tempest know they weren't alone out here. Caspian Abernathy, he said. It was probably best not to use his real name. No rank, and we're just scavengers, looking for scrap. Bullshit, the voice said. Coalition shuttle, Coalition uniforms. He indicated all four of them with a yank of his rifle. Listen, Cas began. We're just... Caspian? He turned to one of the beings behind him. Their opaque helmet temporarily went gray, then turned transparent, and a face Cas never thought he'd see again stared right back at him. Samaya? She was older, much older. Her dark hair now sported streaks of silver, but it suited her. The biggest difference was she no longer had a right eye. Instead, a nasty scar disappeared underneath a makeshift patch that had been affixed over the skin. Only her left hazel one remained. How? You were supposed to be on the Atlas. Commander, drop your weapons, Samaya said, addressing the man who'd been interrogating them. But, ma'am, that's an order, Commander. Aye. He motioned to the others with his free hand, and they all stowed their weapons on their backs. Talia's body language relaxed, as did Jan's and Ryan's. How could Samaya be here? She'd been the operations officer aboard the Atlas, his old ship. The ship he'd been first officer aboard, and the one he'd betrayed to save the Sill. Everyone aboard that ship had been killed when they'd activated the stolen Sill technology. Samaya couldn't be here. It wasn't possible. My God, you've barely aged today, she said, coming up in front of him, the glass bubble separating them. And you've learned how to breathe without an atmosphere. Cas glanced down. He'd forgotten about Regis Field. It's a bit of technology we picked up while we were away. He took a glance at the other five surrounding them. Each had dropped the shields in their helmets, so their faces were visible. All five of them were human. The one who'd begun interrogating Cas was a square-jawed behemoth who looked like he could take a sledgehammer to the face without so much as a flinch. We thought you were... well, we weren't sure what you were, Samaya said. All we knew was a coalition ship was approaching. Sometimes those bastards used our own ships against us, in the later years, you know, to get in behind our lines. Trojan horse, one of the others said. Cas wasn't sure what a Trojan horse was, but he understood the idea. The Athru would take a ship and kill everyone on board, then use that ship to get behind any coalition lines or stronghold. And before anyone realized it, they'd already be inside, infiltrating from behind. Come on, Samaya said. Let's get you down into the bowels. It's impossible to talk with these things on. She motioned that they should follow her. Cas glanced at the others, all who seemed just as confused as he was. We need to calm Tempest, Talia said. Give them an update of the situation. No, the square-jawed man said. No outside comms. They can detect them from light years away. Talia shot Cas an alarmed look. It's okay, Ensign. I know this woman. Or at least I did. A lifetime ago, Samaya said, a smile in her voice. We'll be okay, Cas said. Although he couldn't say that for sure. Samaya had been aboard the Atlas when he decided to shut down the weapons so they couldn't fire on the Sill. And she'd been there when Rutledge had Cas remanded to his quarters, then to the brig. And she'd been there at his trial, where Cas was sentenced to hard labor on a penal colony. And in all that time, she never said a word. Before everything that had happened with the ship, Cas always thought her a good soul and a very competent officer. If he recalled correctly, she'd been married to one of the engineers on the Atlas, John. Cas had liked him, too, right up until he watched as both of them sat in the audience and didn't offer a word of defense for him and his actions. But in Samaya's case, that had been a quarter of a century ago, while for Cas, it was only about 7 years. Perhaps in all that time she'd changed. Not to mention, she might be able to tell them what happened after the Athru arrived, though he'd still like to get his hands on the computer logs. They led them through the rest of the officers' corridors and back down through some adjacent systems until they reached close to the center of the station. This was where all of the guts of the station were housed. Environment generators, gravity stabilizers, waste reclamation, recycling, and the 1,000 other systems that kept the station running behind the scenes. "Welcome to Starbase 5, Samaya said, as they passed through 2 different force barriers and emerged out onto a catwalk lining one long wall. Below them, the room opened up, and the first thing Cas saw were the beds lined in rows. But beyond them were different stations that had been set up. One for food prep, another for cleaning, another for what looked like target practice. And milling about below them were at least 4 dozen more humans. Some in coalition uniforms, while others, including children, walked around in civilian clothes. Upon taking it all in, Cas shivered. "Remind you of somewhere?" Ryan asked, leaning in. It did. It resembled a sanctuary they'd seen on the Bulak hub. Samaya and the others removed their helmets. "You can shut off your fields if you like. There's plenty of air." "How do you keep all of this hidden?" Jan asked. "I was scanning the whole time and didn't pick up a thing." "You don't survive as long as we have without learning how to disappear," the interrogator said, removing his helmet and shaking his head. His forehead was covered with sweat. "Catherine, I need to get this unit in the shop. The life support is malfunctioning." Samaya nodded. "Go on, we'll be fine." The man gave a brief nod to Cas and the rest of his crew before heading off down the catwalk to a set of narrow stairs leading down into the room. 2 of the other escorts followed him, while 2 others stayed with them. "Commander Hank Graydon, formerly of the USCS Constantinople," Samaya said. "My second in command, and a damn fine officer." "You're in charge here?" Cas asked. Samaya smiled. "Although I don't know if you'd call it in charge. These are 2 of my best security officers, though they started out in much different fields once upon a time. May I introduce Lieutenant Alden Belmont and Ashley Harcrow." Belmont sported a short blonde cut and couldn't have been more than 25, Cas thought to himself, while Harcrow was probably in her mid-40s, and while she was smiling, it didn't reach her dark brown eyes. "Pleasure," Harcrow said, while Belmont only nodded. "Right," Cas said, realizing he was expected to finish the introductions. "Captain Satarina Jan and Dorsey Ryant of the Sphere Corps, and Ensign Imas Talia, our Chief Security Officer." "The Sphere Corps?" Belmont's eyes went wide. "How did you survive?" Ryant and Jan exchanged a worried look as Samaya stepped forward. "It seems we have a lot to discuss. Come with me. I have a place that's a bit more private." She maneuvered her way around them on the catwalk and led Cas and the others to a different set of stairs than the ones Graydon had descended. It dropped them into a series of makeshift rooms, and they stopped in front of one just long enough for Samaya to step out of her suit and toss it through an opening shielded with nothing but a piece of cloth. As the material fluttered to the side, Cas saw it was a small room with a bed and a desk, with equipment and parts cluttering the floor. Her personal quarters. He turned, noticing Belmont and Harcrow had disappeared sometime after they'd come down, probably to their own quarters. "Excuse my lack of manners. They don't do us a lot of good down here," she said, dusting herself off. Her uniform was worn, but it had held up over the years. Cas wondered if it was the only one she still had. This way. Weaving through another set of corridors, Cas couldn't help but think again of the hub, with its dirty streets and people begging for anything he could give them. It was hard to think this was probably the reality of the situation all over the Coalition now. Samaya led them into a small room with a makeshift table surrounded by 7 mismatched and old chairs, the fabric on them long since worn away. She indicated they each take a seat, which they did. A moment later, Graydon entered from another side door, having removed his suit as well. "Phil's working on it. Says it should be back up and running soon," he said. Samaya nodded and turned to the rest of them. "Commander, Captains Jan and Ryant, and Ensign Talia." She indicated each of them in turn. "And of course, Caspian Rabot." Free of the suit, Graydon shook each of their hands. "I've heard stories about you for a long time," he said to Cas. "Never thought I'd get to put a face with a name." "I'm as surprised as you are," Cas said. When Rutledge had told them the Atlas had gone missing, he just assumed everyone aboard was dead. And until they'd entered the station, He'd had no reason to think otherwise. "You're probably wondering how I'm sitting here," she said, a grin plastered on her face. Cas turned to the rest of his crew. "Captain Geisen here was the operations officer on board the Atlas. She was there the day—" "You made a very brave but very stupid decision," Samaya finished. "And I was there for all the days after. 2 seasons after the ship came back, Rutledge sent us out again. Same mission. Only by then he had been promoted to admiral. So guess who got the captain's chair?" Samaya pursed her lips in a grimace, as if remembering eating something unpleasant. "Geraldine Soon." "Bingo," Samaya said. "The former tactical officer," she explained to the rest of the table. "Without Cas as first officer, she was next in line, and she was ruthless. Within a few seasons, we'd already completed our mission." "Damn it," Cas said. "I should have known." "Yes," she said, "you should have. No amount of sabotage on your part was going to stop it. And if you're wondering why I didn't stick up for you—" Her cheeks reddened, and she stood, turning her back to them. "You know, I was about to go on this tirade about how you shouldn't have been so impulsive, and that I didn't support you so I could stay behind and do the work you'd failed to finish. But that's not the truth." She turned back to them. "The truth is, I was afraid I'd end up just like you. All I could think during your trial was if I stood up and said a word against Rutledge, it would be me up on that stand next, and the rest of my life would be stuck in some jail somewhere." Cas didn't know what to say. It wasn't as if he could blame her. No one wanted to go to prison. But still, he'd made the right call. At least he made the only call he felt was right given the situation. And maybe the coalition hadn't been what he thought it was, but his decision had been within the spirit of the coalition. "It wasn't until I saw what happened when you weren't there to stop it that changed my mind," Samaya continued. "And I accidentally killed one of them myself. It was in that moment I knew I couldn't continue. Not if I ever wanted to sleep again." "You killed a Sill?" Ryan said, leaning forward. "I'm not proud of it. But he startled me, and I—" She trailed off. "Doesn't matter. What was important was I make sure the Coalition could never use the technology they stole." Realization dawned on Cas. It was you. You sabotaged the weapon, so when they activated it, it would malfunction, and the Coalition would consider the test a failure. He stood. You single-handedly stopped the entire program from going forward. She smiled in response. "It took years of planning, but John and I were close to the project. We had the access. And we made sure to not be on that ship when they activated it the first time. We stole the shuttle the day before the test, after we were sure it was foolproof." "But all those people," Jan said, "on the ship, didn't they deserve some warning?" Samaya's face hardened. "Considering not a one of them seemed to have a problem with what we were doing? No, they didn't." Her clipped tone told Cas that was the end of that subject, but he couldn't help but laugh out loud. "What's so funny?" He glanced at Graydon. "Because the only reason I'm here is because Rutledge needed someone who knew something about the project to find out what went wrong. He sent someone deep into Sargan territory to fish me out, just so I could find the ship and diagnose the problem." Samaya smirked. "That is funny." She reset herself. "So that explains why you're not dead in some cell somewhere. But it doesn't tell me how the hell do you look so young." "That," Cas said, "is another story altogether." 13. Evie stared at the screen, watching what was left of Starbase 5 float in the distance. If she squinted, it was almost beautiful, all of the debris forming kind of a protective barrier around the station. But it didn't fill her with any kind of hope or promise for the rest of the Coalition. Sure, 5 was right on the edge of Coalition space, and had probably been one of Andromeda's first targets. But still, what resistance they'd mounted had been inadequate. She hoped it wasn't as dire as she'd made it in her mind. "Anything yet?" she asked Saul, who'd taken over for Talia in her absence. It was telling they didn't even have a backup qualified tactical officer to take her place. Wasn't there supposed to be at least one more on the rotation? But she supposed between the losses at Omicron Terminus and down on the planet, she should be glad to have any crew at all. Still, she couldn't help but look at the tactical station and feel a sense of longing. "No signal yet. They must be having trouble finding a suitable port," Saul said. "Or they've run into trouble." Evie stood, clasping her hands behind her back. "Tell Ravenkill to get a small squad ready. I want her to be prepared to launch the moment we see something out of the ordinary." "Aye," Saul said. She turned to Wolf. "Is there anything you can do to the scanners? Increase their range or sensitivity? I can't believe Zenfor would go to all the trouble of upgrading every system on this ship other than the ones that tell us what's out there in front of us." Evie was being short, and she knew it, but she didn't care. This entire situation had put her on edge, and she could be as short as she wanted. Wolf glanced up at her. "We have some increased sensitivity, but we've already been using it. Remember I told you about it during our first meeting?" "Oh," Evie stepped back. Had she? She couldn't remember. Why was she still having persistent memory issues? It had been nearly a week since she'd woken back up. The effects shouldn't still be lingering this long, should they? "Commander, you have the bridge," she added, then headed for the hypervator. "Yes, ma'am," Wolf replied. If there was surprise in her voice, Evie didn't hear it. Instead, she got inside the hypervator and willed the doors to close faster. Once she was sealed inside and it was on the move, she took several short, shallow breaths. Something was wrong. Evie didn't know what it was, but there was something wrong with her mind, and she couldn't figure out what it was. But it was like being inside someone else's head, someone other than her. She'd never had memory issues before this, and she certainly had never felt like every move she made or every order she gave came from someone else. Someone else's body, someone else's mind. Once out of the hypervator, she kept a brisk pace until she reached her room, throwing herself inside before the doors could finish opening. She clambered on the desk and took her sword down from where she'd hung it back up in the wall a few days prior. As soon as it was in her hands, an immediate calm came over her, and she felt like she could breathe again. Maybe it was because the sword was the one thing that connected her to her family, at least the family she wanted to remember. As far as she was concerned, the business with her father was long finished. And her mother, well, that was a lost cause. Without him to give her any more information, there was little more she could do. And yet, for some reason, when she thought of her mother, she felt an overwhelming need to continue her fruitless search. But how? All attempts at finding her records had come up blank on the Coalition database. But something deep inside told Evie she needed to keep looking, that the search wasn't over. That creeping feeling of being an imposter in her own body slivered up her spine again. Not even the sword helped. She placed it back on the magnetic hooks holding it to the wall and took a step back. She was being foolish. She was herself. There was nothing else to it. She was just disoriented because she'd been out for so long and missed so much. She wasn't used to missing all the action. Why had she even come down here? Cas and the others were over on that station, and she needed to be focused on the mission at hand. She needed to be back up at the bridge, not wallowing in self-pity here in her quarters. Evie straightened out her uniform, pulled her ponytail over her shoulder, and turned to exit. But when she did, she caught her own reflection in the adjacent mirror, and for the briefest of moments, she saw her own jaws stretched wide in a grisly smile, revealing rows upon rows of sharp-pointed teeth. That's a lot to take in, Samaya said, after Cas had spent the past 20 minutes explaining a truncated version of everything that had happened to them since finding the Atlas. And you're just now returning to Coalition space? He nodded. For a lot of us, 18 years ago was last week. But about a third of our crew stayed aboard the ship and aged in different increments, depending on how long they stayed in stasis, such as Captain Riot here. The pilot produced a small wave of his hand, a terse smile on his face. Samaya exchanged glances with Graydon, whose face hadn't shown a hint of emotion the entire time Cas was speaking. Jan and Talia remained leaned over the table, but both had stayed silent during the tale. So you don't know? Cas took her meaning. We have an idea, but no, we don't. The reason we came over to the station was to try and download the computer core, at least give us a starting point on what's happened over the past 18 years. Damn, Samaya said, standing. Damn! She yelled right to the ground as the rest of them watched her. She took a slow breath, and Cas caught the end of it had a ragged, wet sound to it. We thought, when you weren't Athru, we thought you might be a rescue vessel. That the Coalition might have finally beat. She trailed off. Too much to hope for, I guess. We are one of the larger refugee or resistance groups, Graydon said. Whichever term you prefer, they both fit. One of the larger? There were less than 60 people as far as Cas had seen. How long have you been here? About 2 years. Can't stay anywhere too long, otherwise their hunting parties will find you. Longest we've ever been in one place was, 3, Samaya? She dropped her eyes. All the fight had gone out of her the moment she'd realized they hadn't come on behalf of the Coalition. And Cas could understand it. To spend all those years fighting to survive, only to watch as each hope for some relief was destroyed again and again. He was amazed they made it for this long. I'm too old for this shit, Samaya said, pushing herself back up. What's the situation with the rest of the Coalition? Jan asked. Cas wanted to know as well, but a part of him didn't want to hear. It was almost as if no one told them none of it had happened yet. It was a proverbial Schrodinger's cat, except this time the cat was made up of 14 trillion lives and about 1,000 star systems. Wait a second, Cas said. Are those all of your people out there? Are there any more? Samaya shook her head. Then we have plenty of space for them on Tempest. So we can't be a rescue vessel. We also have plenty of supplies for everyone. They're not all military, she frowned. We have a lot of civilians, some who didn't even know what the Coalition was like before this life. That's fine, Cas said. We can transport them all over. We have the shuttles. Samaya turned to Graydon. What do you think? I think it's the best option I've heard in about a decade. He addressed Cas. We have a few shuttles of our own, and one long-range fighter I managed to save for my own ship. She needs repairs, but she's a tough little ship. Jan perked up. A long-range fighter? Like a Falcon class? Graydon's visage cracked for the first time. Try Ravage class, he grinned. Jan turned to Cas, grabbing his arm. I need to see that ship. Without any dissent from the others, he regarded Samaya. We'd be happy to have you aboard, but I need you to drop whatever you've got that's blocking this place from our sensors so I can comm my ship. I made the mistake of inviting friends back to the ship once without her permission, and it didn't go so well. Samaya creased her brow. If we drop the field, the Athru will be able to find us. I'm surprised they haven't already picked up your ship. Are their sensors that sensitive? Graydon shrugged. We don't know, but we like to err on the side of caution. It's kept us alive this far. It was clear to Cas these two had worked together for some time. They had an easygoing nature about them, common in colleagues who were used to each other. Cas couldn't help but wonder where Samaya's husband was. He hadn't seen him in the compound anywhere. Was he even still alive? Then Jan and I will go back. Riot, you and Talia stay here and help everyone prepare to move. We'll want to do it as quickly as possible. If they're right and we're already on the Athru radar, I don't want to stay here any longer than necessary." He motioned to Samaya. "Do you want to return with us? You might make a better case to my captain than I would." She stared at him underneath hooded eyes. "I still can't believe you're not the captain. Weren't you supposed to be the youngest starship captain in Coalition history?" Cas shrugged. "It happened, eventually. Except instead of exploring the galaxy, I was stuck ferrying rich people across the Sargan Commonwealth." Samaya's eyes fell for a brief second, but then regained their vigor. "Sounds like a plan to me. I can accompany you back." She turned to Graydon. Before she could say anything further, he was out of his seat. "I'll start preparing people. What sort of housing situation will we be looking at? I need to tell them how much they can bring with them." "We've got space for everyone to have their own room if they want it," Cas said. "I would say as much as they can carry, and any essential supplies you need, such as medicines, though the ship is well stocked." "I wouldn't be so sure," Samaya said. "There've been a few new bugs creep up over the years, especially in humans. We don't know if it's the work of the Athru or just bad luck, but some can be pretty nasty." Cas made a mental note. "Sent everyone through decon before they mix with the crew, myself included. Okay then. Everyone get started. We don't want to linger." 14. "So," Cas said, staring at the woman now 30 years his senior instead of just 10. She might have more gray in her hair, but she hadn't lost any of her drive. To have sabotaged the Atlas was a stroke of genius, even if it had led to him being reined back in. If it hadn't been for Samaya, Cas never would have met Evie, or Green, or Dorsey, or even Zenfor. He never would have done anything of consequence, just continued to ferry people back and forth for Vina for all eternity. He owed her more than he could vocalize. "So," she mimicked, "you're still not technically an officer." He shook his head. The shuttle bounced slightly as Jan piloted through the debris field. "Sorry," she said, "unavoidable." It barely registered to Cas. The woman sitting across from him was from another life, a past so foreign to him it felt like it belonged to someone else. "I tried it for a brief time. Wasn't for me," he said. "I guess you figured out the Coalition wasn't all it was cracked up to be." "Especially after my time in Cathora." Jan's attention remained on what lay ahead of them. He hadn't told anyone other than Evie what he'd gone through on that planet, and he didn't plan to. People weren't ready to hear the Coalition was running a secret mining operation that killed most of the humans that worked there. "I've never been, but I heard it was hell," Samaya said, scratching the area right underneath the patch. She caught him looking at it. "Yeah, I didn't have access to modern-day medicine at the time. It was either lose the eye or, well, it was lose the eye." Cas leaned his head back against the bulkhead. The tiny vibrations in the shuttle hummed through him. "How did it happen?" "Accident," she said. But he saw something else in there, something deep and painful. He decided not to pry any further. And despite wanting badly to ask her about John, he'd refrained from that as well. She'd tell him if she felt comfortable, but he had to imagine she was somewhat perplexed by him and Tempest showing up out of nowhere. He hadn't yet regained her trust. "Here we are," Jan said as the field cleared. "Tempest, this is Kirkus coming in. Bay 1. "Affirmative, Kirkus. Proceed," the launch bay operator's voice said. Jan swung the shuttle so Tempest was right in front of them, the bay open wide. Samaya stood, staring out of the ship through the window. "God damn! You weren't kidding about your ship. It looks brand new." "It's as much of a shock to us as it is to you," Cas said. "From my perspective, it was on the verge of self-destruction a week ago." "Still, do you know how long it's been since I've even seen a Coalition starship? Much less a Dragon class? Beautiful design." Cas stared out the window with her. "How long has it been?" Too long. Jan pulled the shuttle into the bay with expert precision, and Cas tapped the back of his hand. Evie, are you there? Go ahead. Did her voice sound odd? He wasn't sure. So much had happened, it might just be his imagination. Can you meet me in Bay 1? We found survivors. What? Why didn't you come earlier? He could tell by the heaviness of her breath she was already out of her chair and on the move. Apparently the aliens are monitoring Coalition space. They might know we're here. We didn't want to risk further spikes on their screens. He'd almost said Athu instead of aliens. He needed to be more careful. Evie didn't know of them like that yet, and he wasn't sure if the word would trigger anything for her. Cas didn't want to be the one to say it. Perhaps if it came from someone else, it wouldn't be as big of a threat to her psyche. Jan set the ship down and engaged all the moorings, shutting off the shuttle's power. In one piece, as promised. Thanks, Cas said. Stay close. We'll probably be sending the fleet over to pick up everyone. You know, she said, if you keep assigning me to these shuttle missions and away from my ship with all the guns, I'm apt to become irritated. Cas saw the same humor in her face he'd seen when she had tricked him down to the planet with a spider sensor. Was she flirting with him? Of course she is, you moron. By Cor, you're dense. Don't worry, Captain. I'll have you back out there blowing holes in things before you know it. He wanted to smack himself for the idiocy. He was terrible at this. But she smiled anyway. It was the thought that counted, right? He was rusty. The last time he'd had anything serious was back on his first assignment. Her. Geez, Samaya said, stepping out of the shuttle. Cas threw one last look at Jan, at Saturina, and winked before following her out. I'd forgotten how large they were. The bays. We've got a Waterfall-class ship in the debris field somewhere. Graydon and I stripped it of anything useful when we arrived here, but there wasn't much. When you're not around these ships, it slips your mind. It was normal for Cas. He'd become used to it ever since coming aboard. Commander? He turned to see Evie striding toward them, one of the security officers accompanying her. Why is it every time I send you off, you never come back alone? There was a smile in her face, probably for Samaya's comfort, but her voice was deadly serious. I know what you're thinking, he said, but this is different. May I present Lieutenant Commander... He double-checked her rank on her uniform. Sorry, Captain Samaya Geisen, former operations officer of the USCS Atlas. Evie was momentarily stunned. Captain Diazol, pleasure to meet you, Samaya said, holding out her hand. Evie took it, giving her a hearty shake. I heard a lot about you in the time before. We all figured you were dead. Not yet, Evie said, trying to regain her composure. You were on the Atlas? Cas stepped forward. We need to talk, he said. There's a lot to cover. 15 minutes later, they were in the conference room off the bridge. The entire way there, Captain Geisen couldn't quit commenting on how clean and new everything looked. Evie had pressed her for information about the Coalition, but she only offered small nuggets, saying it was best to get it all out at once. When they stepped on the bridge, their new ally was struck with awe when she caught sight of Lieutenant Zoll, and she grew quiet when Evie mentioned they had a Klaxian on board. She wasn't sure whether Captain Geisen's silence was a good thing or not, but it didn't leave her with a good feeling in her stomach. I assume Cas has already filled you in on all the details, Evie said once they were seated around the table. All the important parts, Cas said, putting himself closer to the table. First things first, Captain, Geisen said. Caspian told me you had room for our group over on the station. We have a complement of 58. About 40% of those are former military. The rest are civilians and families. Evie exchanged glances with Cas, who seemed to her like a puppy pleading for a treat. Of course they could take them on. But as for keeping them long-term? Without a starbase or other port in which to deposit them, Evie had to consider they might become permanent members of her complement. And while they could use the help from the ones who'd been in the Coalition, this ship was not outfitted for civilians like some of the larger ships were. They need to make special arrangements. Of course, Evie folded her hands. Whatever you need. We can start transporting you over immediately. There's the other matter, Cas said, of the alien sensors. I was thinking we might be able to use whatever technology they're using over on the station for Tempest. Hide us from their scanners. Are you sure you want to leave? Evie asked. It was a valid question. They might be safer to stay where they were. If we'd only arrived, I'd say yes. But they'd find us here eventually. And we'll need to move soon anyway. If we can adapt the technology for your ship and stay on the move, we'll be much better equipped to avoid them. She glanced around the room. Besides, most of my people aren't eating enough. I'd like them to have full bellies at least once in the last 2 decades. Evie nodded. Given the choice, she wouldn't want to be trapped on some derelict station either. She couldn't even imagine the kind of life these people had endured over the past 18 years. All at once, her heart went out to them. She tapped her personal comm. Commander Wolf? Coordinate with the base to send enough shuttles to transport 58 people and their belongings over from the station. I want the Space Wings to escort the shuttles back and forth. And get it done quickly, understand? Aye, Captain, Wolf said. We'll get started right away. Was that the bald woman I saw on the way in? Geisen asked. Evie nodded. I knew I liked her. My people will do everything they can to make sure yours are safe, Evie said, and she meant it. Now, what can you tell us about the last 18 years? Geisen leaned back in her chair, her hands on the plush armrests. Evie noticed she caressed them lightly with her thumbs. If I start from the beginning, I have to say I knew about the Andromeda threat early on, considering I was on the ship trying to procure a weapon to stop it. But once my husband and I decided to sabotage said weapon, we knew we couldn't stay. We escaped to Sargan space. I know the feeling, Cas muttered, grinning as he said it. And that's where we were when the reports of the first attacks came across the news outlets. Very quickly, things began to fall apart. The Athru attacked our communication systems first. Evie held up a hand. I'm sorry, who? Geisen gave her a confused look. The Athru. That's what they call themselves. I thought you had that intel. We had speculation, Cas interrupted before she could respond. Evie noticed his voice had gone up in pitch. Nothing concrete. Well, Geisen continued, they weren't calling themselves Andromeda. Anyway, once they began attacking the communications infrastructure, information became scarce. We got the initial reports of the attacks on the stations and planets along the border, where we sit right now. After that, it was more about what incoming ships had heard or seen, rather than what we got from official channels. Believe it or not, most of the Sargans have access to the Coalition info grid and receive a majority of the channels. A few still operated, but the primary ones only showed the emergency broadcast messages. She took a breath, as if the story itself was wearing her out. And Evie figured it probably was. It had to be harrowing to relive some of the worst moments of your life. It was a feeling she could relate to, or at least she thought she could. Something about bad memories gnawed at the back of her brain, but she pushed it aside and focused her attention on Geisen. The Sargans, well, you know them. They decided to stay out of it. Didn't want to get their hands dirty with what they felt was purely a Coalition problem. Obviously, they were hoping the Athru would take care of the Coalition for them, then allow them to run in this sector unchecked. It's what they've always wanted. There was a lot of talk from the official houses and the royalty about how the Sargan Commonwealth was about to enter a brand new era. It wasn't until we began to see footage of what the Athru were doing that they changed their tune. What do you mean? Cas asked. What kind of footage? John and I were out on Devil's Gate, a station right on the edge of Sargan and Coalition territory. We know it well, Evie said. not wanting to get into the details of how or why.
Then you know it's controlled by the Marrow family. After their daughter Vina was killed, her brothers took over. That's neither here nor there, but the Marrow brothers would often bring in contraband from the Coalition. I don't know when they started, sometime before we got there. But it was always a big deal to see the transport ship coming in from across the border. The only way I can swear they got away with it was the Coalition was too distracted with the other matters to notice. The ship gets into port, and the captain doesn't have the cargo.
Geisen gestured with her hands.
He says the supplies had never made it to Starbase 8, because there are no more supplies. But before the Marrow brothers can take him away for interrogation, he throws up this video in the middle of the main concourse, out there where it's the busiest, and it shows all these ships swarming around a dark red planet. Within seconds, the planet explodes. Just explodes. And as everyone is standing there stunned, he says that was Mishtaka, the planet that manufactured all the cargo he normally brought over.
She took another breath and dropped her eyes.
After that, people just lost it. I've never seen so many ships take off at once, or so many people trying to rob the establishments. The bars were overrun within seconds, and I knew we needed to get out of there. I'm not sure anyone understood the extent of the threat until that point. Those of us on the Atlas knew about the telescope data, but to see a Coalition world destroyed in front of our eyes was something none of us were prepared for.
Evie glanced over to see Cas watching her. His eyes were filled with what? Worry? Compassion? She couldn't quite tell. But Captain Geisen's story had confirmed her suspicions. The Athru, the word felt strange in her head, and she wasn't sure why, had done what everyone had suspected, and Tempest hadn't been here to help.
What about the core worlds? What about Earth, Claxia Prime, Beta Leonis? What happened to them?
Geisen shook her head.
I don't know. We've never been close to the core. I've heard rumors they destroyed Earth, that it was one of the first targets, but they kept Claxia Prime intact, which is all because they're only hunting down the humans.
Evie felt a pressure in the back of her head, like an oncoming headache.
Wait, what? They're only attacking human settlements?
Geisen nodded.
Mishtaka was a mostly human colony, as were a lot of the other targets. I know they left Untu alone. I spoke to another cell that had come from there, and Okar and Gorov were untouched.
What kind of defense did the Coalition put up? Cas asked. Geisen lingered on his question a moment.
I can only tell you what I've seen. But every station, every shipyard, every ship we came across has been torn apart and left for scrap. As far as we know, the Coalition fell long ago, and the Athru have been hunting the rest of us down ever since. Which is why seeing this ship approach us gave us a lot of pause. We thought it was a trick.
Understandable, Evie said, given your situation. She glanced out the conference room windows at the remains of the station floating in the distance.
Well, Captain, I know this is exhausting. I think you've given us the big picture. We can always go over details with you or some of your crew later. But for now, I want to make sure we get everyone aboard quickly.
Evie stood, and the others followed.
Thank you for sharing what you know with us.
She stuck out her hand. Geisen took it.
I know it's probably not what you were hoping to hear, but a lot of us still remain. We're out here, surviving in the shadows. Maybe with your ship, we all have a chance at a new life.
Evie turned to her first officer.
Cas, can you make sure the captain gets adequate quarters, then assist Wolf with the transport schedule? I want to get those adjustments in place, so we're not lit up like a beacon.
Sure, Cas replied. Come on, Captain. Let's get you settled. Evie noticed Cas had a relaxed air about him around Geisen she hadn't normally seen in him. Was it simple familiarity with someone from his past, or something more? She supposed if she saw a good friend from one of her old postings, she'd probably slip back into an easygoing manner too, because it would remind her of a life before all this. If she thought things had been difficult before, it was nothing against what lay in front of them. 15. "You okay?" Cas asked as they rode the hypervator back down to the bays. Samaya had been quiet as he'd taken a few minutes to assign her standard crew quarters and show her their location. She barely looked at the room before insisting she helped him moving everyone over. "Define okay," she replied. Bad choice of words. "I guess what I want to know is, can I handle this? Am I going to fold under the pressure?" She turned to him. "If you'd asked me that 25 years ago, I wouldn't have been able to say. But once I decided what to do, everything else became easy after that. Because it was all about following a moral compass. And it hasn't led me wrong so far." He desperately wanted to ask about her husband, and wasn't sure he could hold it in much longer. "You haven't been back to 8 since everything happened, have you?" A grin formed across her copper complexion. "You're wondering what happened to Rutledge?" He didn't reply, but he had to admit he was curious. Not only about Rutledge, but also Joro Page, the former tactical officer for Tempest, who had tried to kill Box. When they left Coalition space, both of them had been secure within the walls of the station's high-security wing, destined to live out their lives there, if necessary. "I haven't been to 8 myself, but I've heard stories. About 5 years after the attacks, we were on a transport headed for Spaxia, and this old trader said she'd been there when the Athru arrived at the station. Instead of cleaving it like they did to 5 out there, they actually came aboard and began executing humans one by one." She shrugged. "As horrific as that sounds, it made me think they might have revised their tactics. Because this trader told us they arrived about a year after the initial invasion, and it had taken them that long to get across the Coalition, assuming they hadn't stopped. He wasn't sure why, but finding out 8 hadn't been obliterated gave him some semblance of hope. Does that mean it's still there, the station?" "As far as I know. But I heard Rutledge tried to negotiate with the Athru when they approached him, that he tried to switch sides and help them hunt down humans." She shot him a knowing look. "That son of a—" "Hang on," Samaya said, holding up a hand. "Think about that for a minute. How would that old trader have gotten that intel?" Cas took it in. "Someone must have been there, witnessed. And how many people do you think the Athru would have left behind to witness such an event?" Her smile had faded. "Well, if they weren't human, I'm not sure. Why?" The hypervator doors opened, and they walked out into the corridor, turning right. The opening to Bay 1 was a few meters ahead of them. "Because it fits a convenient narrative," Samaya said. "Rutledge may have been a grade-A asshole, but he wasn't a traitor. It's all rumors and hearsay. That old trader didn't know what she was talking about. She was just spinning stories. Probably 80% of everything I know isn't substantiated and can't be counted on. Make sure your captain knows that as well." Cas masked his frustration. They were coming into this completely blind. Even a little information had to be better than none, right? Then why even tell us? "You wanted to know what I know, so I told you. But my experience has been very limited. We're lucky if we can find undercurrent-capable spacecraft, and when we do, it's always a fight to keep them running. We haven't seen most of the Coalition since everything happened. Travel is a luxury. Just keep your eyes open for the unexpected." She was right. They couldn't count on a bunch of second-hand information. But it was better than nothing. It was a starting point, at least. He had no idea what Evie must be thinking, or what her next move might be. But in that moment, he was very glad he and Box had gone ahead with the procedure. because if they hadn't, it would be him up in that command room trying to figure out what to do. I suppose he was cut off by a large shadow in the doorway to the bay, which if he hadn't stopped at the last moment, he would have run into its owner. Cas glanced up. Consul? He was about to ask what she was doing down here, until he realized she was staring exclusively at Samaya, and his heart jumped into his throat. Samaya stood back, taking in Zenfor's 2.5-meter frame, and she went pale, all the blood draining from her face. "Oh," escaped her lips, and nothing else. Captain Samaya Geisen, this is Consul Zenfor of the Sil Alliance. Consul? Captain Geisen is one of the refugees from the station." He moved to position himself between them, but Zenfor held out a hand. "I know who she is," the Sil replied, "and I know what she's done." By Garth, word on the ship spread fast. How long had they been over here? An hour? He had hoped for more prep time before dealing with this inevitability. Samaya held out her hands. "Consul, please accept my sincere—" "Save your worthless apologies," Zenfor snapped, leaning down so her face was directly in front of Samaya's. "They mean nothing. Your actions, however, mean far more." Cas motioned for Samaya to back up, which she did, and he moved around Zenfor's hand to stand in front of her. "She's not the one who ordered the attack on your people. She was following orders. Her purpose was to help the mission. You can understand that." Zenfor's eyes flashed with anger, an anger Cas hadn't seen since they'd returned, and he'd hoped had been well in her past. But it seemed old habits die hard. They'd only been back a week, and already she was on edge again. "And yet, your people have the choice whether to follow orders or not, and she chose to follow them, more than once, and she never came to your aid." He could almost feel the anger radiating off the Sil. If he didn't do something soon, Zenfor might kill her by pure accidental rage. She was the one who sabotaged the weapon they stole. She made it kill everyone who was involved. Cas gritted his teeth. It wasn't ideal. Championing the death of 100 Coalition personnel wasn't typically a good thing, but it might be the one piece of information that saved Samaya's life at the moment. Zenfor raised herself to her full height. "And here I thought they were too stupid to figure out how to use it. That's how we wanted it to look," Samaya said, "that the technology was beyond us, because it didn't belong to us." Zenfor stared at them a moment, then stepped forward, grabbing Samaya by the collar. "Zen, no!" Cas yelled. The consul lifted Samaya a few centimeters off the ground, then casually tossed her to the side, where she slammed into the bulkhead, falling to the ground in a heap. Without another word, Zenfor walked away down the hall. Samaya coughed and sputtered as Cas ran over to help her up. "Jesus, are you okay?" She coughed again. "I think." Drawing a deep breath, she held it for a second before letting it out again. "Damn old body. There used to be a time I could handle something like that better." With Cas's help, she stood, leaning on the wall. Another passing crewman came over to assist, but Cas waved him away. "Trust me, you got off light. She's hit me twice before, and each time I was in so much pain, I thought it would kill me." Cas made sure she was stable before letting go. "Not that it wasn't deserved," Samaya said, turning to watch Zenfor's massive form continue down the corridor. "Did she know someone on the ship we captured?" Cas nodded. "Another Sil told me she did. Maybe her brother? I'm still not fully versed on Sil family dynamics. I just hope—" She shook her head, not finishing the thought. Instead, she pushed away from the wall, standing under her own power. "We were on our way to assist the shuttles?" "I can take care of that. Why don't you go to sickbay to make sure—" "No. I will not be relegated to a bed when I can still be useful. I'll check with your doctors after we've gotten my people on board, and not a moment sooner." She stared at him with a deep intensity that told Cas she wasn't going to take no for an answer. He nodded. "Then let's get it done quick." Evie watched the different lines light up the view screen on the bridge. The red represented shuttles headed back to the station, and green represented shuttles on their way back. All but 5 of the people had already been transported, but they were still waiting on this equipment they needed to help shield the ship from the Athru. She rolled the word around in her mind. It was so familiar, like she'd heard it before somewhere, but she couldn't recall where. Behind her, the hypervator opened, but she barely registered it. Her thoughts remained focused on that word. It was like feeling a memory rather than actually remembering it. And the fact she couldn't remember bothered her. "Excuse me, Captain?" Evie turned to face a man that had to be at least half a meter taller than her, salt and pepper stubble covering most of the lower part of his weathered face. But his eyes were a vibrant blue. He wore a coalition uniform, though it was faded and torn at least half a dozen places. But she saw the rank on the side of his lapel. "Commander?" "Graydon. Hank Graydon, sir," he said, holding out his hand. "Ma'am is fine, Commander. You're Captain Geison's second, is that right?" She took his hand. He had a firm grip, but she noticed she caught him by surprise as he raised his eyebrows at the strength of her own hand. "Yes, ma'am. She told me to assist you with anything you might need while they got the final shuttles across." While his attention remained on her, she caught his eyes grazing the rest of the bridge, stopping for a moment on Zal. "Tell me what I need to know about the system you have that keeps the Athru from finding you." She gestured for him to take the empty configurable station behind Tactical. His stature reminded her a bit of Zenfor, though she would dwarf even him. "It's a specialized field generator," Graydon said. "We've only used it on smaller ships before, but I don't see why it shouldn't be scalable with your power reserves. The Athru use Candom radiator particles that help power their scanners, which means they can penetrate most anything. So what we had to do was develop the same technology. We had to do some fine-tuning, but once we figured out the frequency range, we were able to emit a negative signal, so when they scan us, it passes right over, showing empty space." "Clever," Evie said, even though she only understood part of it. Physics was not her forte. "But we also have to continually adjust it, because otherwise, when they aren't scanning for us, we'd be very easy to detect due to the amount of radiation we emit. It's a delicate balance." Evie was only half listening. Her mind had pulled her back to that word again, Athru. It was like she was being drawn to the word for some reason, and in her mind she felt that same pressure as before. Only this time it was stronger, more urgent, almost like a pulse. "Captain?" She glanced up to see Graydon staring at her. Oh shit. How long had he been talking? She probably didn't need to make a bad impression with what might be the last humans they'd ever meet. "Sorry. What were you saying?" "Just that." Something snapped in Evie's mind. In the dark spaces of her mind where nothing resided, she saw very clearly the image of 3 ships moving along a trajectory that would put them right on top of Starbase 5 in a matter of seconds. And in that moment, she knew what she saw was true. There was no doubt in her mind. "Raise the armor," Evie yelled. "But the shuttles," Zal began. "Now, Talia, full power to forward armor." She only hoped Zenfor's defensive upgrades could take the strain. Less than a second after the view screen notified them the armor was up, 3 alien ships appeared in their screen, having dissolved into existence. "Time bubbles," Evie whispered. "What the hell?" Graydon said. The ship rocked with a blast of an energy weapon, and Evie clambered into her chair. "Armor holding," Talia said. Alert klaxons sounded all over the ship. "Prepare to collect the shuttles," Evie said. "We need to—" She stopped when one of the alien ships broke off, turning toward what was left of the station, and fired. The station itself exploded in a bright white light. "The shuttles," Evie said, watching the explosion ripple through the debris. 16. Cas had been standing in Bay 1, waiting for the last of the shuttles to fly in, when the ship went into lockdown, while Samaya was off helping to direct where to unload the rest of the cargo from the station. The armor went up, and the massive door rolled down on the normally open bay as the ship rocked back and forth from weapons fire. "Report," Cas yelled. It's an attack, one of the ensigns helping Samaya said. They only drop the doors when we're under assault. He'd been standing beside the cargo when half of it went sliding across the floor. An attack? The Athru couldn't have found them already, could they? He needed to get back up to the bridge. But first, he needed to get the bay open again, so the last of the shuttles could land.
All hands, this is the captain. Full alert. We are under attack by a hostile force,
Evie's voice said over the ship's comm. No shit, Cas thought. But they couldn't leave those shuttles out there. Not only were they carrying the technology that could help obscure Tempest from the Athru, but Jan was piloting one of the shuttles, and there were still 5 of Samaya's crew aboard. Get that bay door back open, he said to the ensign, running back to the main corridor. Then he motioned at Samaya to stay there and help. She nodded as he crossed the threshold, looking for the nearest access ladder.
Cas?
His personal comm chirped. Go ahead. He reached the access ladder that would take him a level up to flight control. It was safer to use the ladder than rely on the hypervators while under attack. He didn't want to get stuck inside.
I need you to get back to engineering. We have to activate the undercurrent again,
Evie said. What about the shuttles? He said, pausing on the 3rd rung.
The Athru destroyed the station. We lost the shuttles on our screens up here. We can't wait around. There are 3 of those things out there.
We can't just leave them, Cas said, debating whether he should keep climbing or not.
Cas, they're gone. Now get to engineering, otherwise none of us is going to make it.
Cas grimaced and punched the bulkhead beside the ladder. The knuckles of his hand came away bloody. He wasn't ready to accept they were dead. Dropping down the ladder, Cas re-emerged in the corridor. Cas to Samaya, he said, tapping his comm as he ran for a different access ladder.
Go ahead.
You have about 3 minutes to find those shuttles and get them back in the bay. Otherwise, we're leaving without them. Cas reached the 2nd ladder. This one traversed the ship vertically and would take him back up to level 10, engineering.
I understand,
she said, cutting the comm. Cas couldn't believe Evie was willing to leave them behind. The ship rocked again, and he almost slipped off the rung. He wanted to both get there and not at the same time, to get the ship into the undercurrent and stay. He only hoped Samaya could reach them before Tempest had the chance to leave. She might need some help. What are you doing? The ensign yelled as Samaya slipped into the cockpit. She hadn't caught his name, but he was on the young side.
Whatever I have to, she said,
shutting the shuttle's door and powering the ship up. It had only been half unloaded so far, but that wouldn't matter as soon as she was out in open space. The shuttle lifted from the pad, and she turned it to the bay door, only to find it was still closed. She motioned to the ensign to get the door open again, and he hesitated a second before she turned her shoulder to him, making sure he could see the captain's insignia embedded there. She watched the mental battle in his mind until he finally decided and ran over to the manual controls beside the main door. He pushed the massive lever inside the box down, and at the far end of the room, the bay doors rolled up again. The fact that everything wasn't sucked out as soon as they did gave Samaya some hope. It meant the force barriers were still in place, which meant the armor hadn't been compromised yet. But she'd need the armor drop for a brief second to get out there.
Hello, Captain.
Samaya glanced at her personal comm at the unfamiliar voice. It had a tinny sound to it, like someone speaking through a can.
Who the hell are you? Sir Boxington III, Supreme Hero of the Coalition, at your service. My associate Caspian told me you might need assistance in your mission.
Samaya furrowed her brow.
I don't understand what is going on.
Something stuck in her throat, and she coughed into her sleeve. The voice said, exasperated and dropping all the pretense. My name is Box. I'm here to help retrieve the shuttles. Do you want my help or not? Box? Was this the mechanical companion Cas had mentioned? It didn't matter. She could figure out details later.
Can you lower the ship's armor? Do you have that capability?
Better than anyone else, Box said. Send me your flight plan. I'll make sure the armor in that section is down.
I don't have...
Your trajectory. Just send me your trajectory out of the bay. Samaya gritted her teeth and uploaded the plan into her comm. This Box was what some of her people might call a loose cannon. "Okay," Box said. "Aim straight for the opening. The armor will be down."
"Go now?"
Samaya asked. "Go!" His mechanical voice grated on Samaya's ears. How did Caspian stand it? She punched the accelerator, and the shuttle blasted toward the opening. But the yellow glow told her the ship's magnetic armor was still up.
Box, I need—"
"Trust. You need trust. Now hold your course," he said.
"What are you—"
No questions. This is a trust exercise. You must trust I will not kill or maim you in a horrific fashion." Samaya watched as the end of the bay grew closer, while the shuttle's speed remained constant. Was he kidding? Was he insane? She had heard of some of the old autos losing their minds after long shutdown periods, and now her life might be in the hands of one. Though if he did end up killing her, he might just be saving the Athru the trouble. There was little chances it was going to work. "And now," Box said, just as the shuttle passed the terminus of the bay. She thought she saw the armor grid flicker for a split second, and then she was in open space. Tempest pulling away at tremendous speed. In front of her were 3 Athru destroyers, or what she'd come to think of destroyers. All she knew was they had a lot of firepower. "No," she whispered. What had been Starbase 5 was now a ball of fire, burning what little oxygen and combustible materials remained. She'd been inside there 2 hours ago. It took her a moment to remember why she was out there. She began a visual scan for the shuttles, trying to pick them out of the debris field. Hopefully, the Athru were too preoccupied with Tempest to worry about her or the other 2 ships that could be mistaken as nothing more than junk. "Captain, are you still with me?" Box asked from the comm.
"Yes, good job back there. But I'm trying to find the missing shuttles. I need to get them back to the ship."
She couldn't pick anything out in the debris. Above her, the 3 ships pursued Tempest as it wound its way through the system, managing to dodge most of the shots. How could a ship that size be so maneuverable? It was acting almost like a space wing fighter. She returned to her scans. A small blip on her screen indicated the possibility of a carbon-based life form. That had to be them.
"Stand by. I think I've got them."
10-4, good buddy. He was so odd, and he seemed to have a different accent for every sentence he uttered. Samaya had to admit she was looking forward to meeting him in person. She coughed again, only realizing this time there was some blood on the fabric of her uniform. This was not what she needed at the moment. Shoving it out of her mind, she focused on getting the shuttle to the other 2, which she could see clearly now, both covered in scorch marks and on a slow tumble through space. They must have been close to the explosion when the Athru blew the station, and they were both floating in roughly parallel directions, though they were growing further apart. Samaya piloted the shuttle to line up with the back of the closest one, initiating a maglock. She didn't dare initiate the comm, but it didn't look like the shuttle had power anyway. Hesitating for just one moment, she hit the button that opened up the back bay. The parallel magnetism also opened the other shuttle's bay, an emergency feature built into all Coalition shuttles at events such as these. Inside, Belmont and Harcrow lay beside their equipment. At the pilot seat was Cass's friend Saturina. All 3 seemed unconscious, and Samaya rushed forward, first grabbing Belmont and dragging him into the shuttle, followed by Harcrow. Finally, she managed to get Saturina inside. But moving all 3 bodies had taken its toll on her, and she coughed even more, spitting blood each time she did.
"The hit from the sill. Maybe Cass was right. I should have gone to sickbay."
But there was nothing she could do about it now. She still needed to get the equipment aboard and rescue the other shuttle. As Samaya pulled the first piece of equipment in, cognizant of just how long this was taking, Saturina stirred. She glanced up at Samaya with a pair of dark blue eyes.
"What?"
"Athru attack," Samaya said, still pulling on the equipment.
"Need to move."
Saturina scrambled up, shaking her head, and got on the other side of the equipment to push.
"How long do we have?" "Not long enough."
Evie stood on the bridge, keeping an eye on the 3 ships.
"Evasive maneuvers, Rond. Keep it tight. We need to get engineering enough time to get the undercurrent generator online."
Any idea how long? He asked. There was concern in his voice, and rightly so.
You just focus on the job I know you can do. Let me worry about how long this will take.
Yes, ma'am, he said, and pulled the ship up into a steep climb relative to its previous angle. Evie had reviewed some of the agility upgrades on the ship, but they hadn't put any of them to the test yet. She glanced at Wolf, who was still working at her station.
What are you still doing up here? Get down to engineering.
Evie rarely raised her voice to the crew, but this was one time when it seemed warranted. Wolf finished whatever she had been working on and gave Evie a sheepish look.
Sorry, on my way now.
She bolted across the bridge and to the hypervator, which arrived immediately. In front of them, space swung like wild, the remnants of the station going in and out of view. Blasts of energy skirted the edges of the screen.
Should I return fire?
Talia asked.
Yes. I don't care if it's effective or not,
Evie said, taking her seat. The negators were doing a good job of keeping any G-forces from affecting them, but watching the screen gave her a queasy feeling.
Just buy us as much time as you can.
Talia nodded, going to work. One of the Athru ships appeared ahead of them. It seemed they were as maneuverable as Tempest. But Ron dropped underneath them, avoiding the volley of weapons fire by flipping the ship on its side. Captain, we have an unscheduled shuttle launch, Zal said. Evie snapped to attention.
What? How is that possible? Is our armor down?
It blinked off for less than a second. I can't explain it.
Who is on that shuttle?
Please tell me it's not Cas. She wouldn't put it past him, especially knowing that Jan and the others had been out there. But there was nothing they could do. The shuttles had been consumed in the destruction of the station. I believe it is Captain Geisen, Zal said, his face impassive. What was going on? Was the entire crew of the Atlas determined to disobey orders and get themselves killed on reckless missions? Though Evie technically didn't outrank Geisen, unless she was to invoke the unwritten rule that the captain with the ship technically had command. She turned to Graydon.
Why would she have left the ship?
She must be thinking she can do something about those shuttles. He stood from the specialist station. Do we have enough time to pick her up? Zal's unmoving face hovered over his console. Unsure. We're over 2,000 kilometers away. The timing will be tight, and she's headed into the debris field. Evie tapped her comm.
Engineering? What's your status?
Preparing to begin the sequence now, Cas said. Stand by. The ship rocked as one of the Athru blasts landed against the hull. Considering how many they were throwing at them, Evie saw it as a minor miracle had it been only the second one to make contact so far.
Minor damage, aft section, Talia said. Armor is holding.
Do it fast, Evie said, then cut the comm.
Commander?
Graydon's attention was wrapped to the action on screen. Yes, ma'am?
Take over the bridge engineering station. We need to know exactly when we can activate the undercurrent if we're going to rescue your captain. You shouldn't do it. They're all lying to you.
Evie jumped, expecting to see someone right beside her, but there was no one. It was as if she'd felt someone's breath on her shoulder, but no one was close enough. Graydon looked at her expectantly.
What?
She asked, unnerved. I said, do you want audio updates? The large man asked.
Yes, whatever you need to do, she replied, shaking her head. I just want to get everyone out of here in one piece.
He took the station as Ron performed another round of aerial acrobatics that should have sent them flying. But Evie felt nothing other than a light pull in one direction or another. She turned away from the screen. Perhaps it was best if she didn't watch. What was wrong with her? She never got space sick. She'd performed maneuvers similar to Ron's in a shuttle and never had an issue with it. Engineering reports they are beginning the sequence now, Graydon announced.
Helm, head back for the debris field. Do you have the shuttle in your sights? Evie asked, still averting her eyes.
It's there, Captain, emerging from the field. But I think one of the alien ships has caught on. They're headed that way. Evie cursed.
Open a comm to the shuttle. There's no point in hiding now, Evie said.
Saul tapped a button. Open.
Captain, I hope you're ready for a bumpy trip.
Evie pulled up a 3D schematic on her small console to the side of her chair. It showed the battle in all dimensions, with Ron's projected course back to the shuttle.
"Ready when you are," Geisen replied. "I've got the crew and the equipment."
Evie's heart dropped. They'd survived? And she had been content to leave them out there? What had she been thinking?
"You were doing what you thought best. No one could fault you for that."
She shuddered and checked her shoulder again, gritting her teeth. She didn't have time for whatever was happening.
"Prepare to be picked up. Mr. Rond, we are going to need some of that skillful precision again."
"Hi, Captain." He turned to his counterpart at navigation. "I'm going to need some help on this, Natalia."
"Already plotting," Ensign Rivers said.
Evie hit her personal comm.
"Cas, status."
"Building the current now." His voice was loud against the rumble of the conduits in the background. "Another 40 seconds, assuming it holds."
"Rond?"
Evie asked.
"It's going to be close,"
River replied. Evie stood, noticing Ron's knuckles were white as he modified the ship's heading, pitch, and angle all at once, still heading for the shuttle. But the Athru ship would get there first. Evie turned to Talia.
"Weapons. Whatever we've got, I don't care. Anything." "Anything?"
Talia asked. The ship rocked again with another blast. "The two behind us are closing," Zal said. "Anything," Evie repeated to Talia, hoping her face conveyed the seriousness of her words. It was possible the future of the coalition lay with them. She had to do everything possible to make sure the ship and her crew survived, now more than ever.
"Aye,"
Talia said, casting her eyes down.
10 seconds to the shuttle," River announced.
"Engineering says the undercurrent generators are holding. They're ready to create the tunnel," Graydon added. Evie nodded to Zal.
"Captain Geisen, hang on to something. All hands, brace yourselves."
She returned to her chair and activated the automatic harness that held her in place. Despite being queasy before, Evie couldn't take her eyes off the screen. The shuttle was so close.
"Firing,"
Talia said, and a great purple blast erupted from somewhere off-screen, impacting the alien ship dead center. At first, nothing happened, but Evie watched in horror as the ship began to crumble in on itself, as if it were being sucked into a tiny hole piece by piece. They were at a dead stop. Talia had used the transdimensional weapon. "Now," Ron said, as the shuttle became so large in the view screen, it seemed as though it would plow through the bridge. Except at the last moment, the view swung wide to the left, and there was nothing but empty space in front of them as the ship slid sideways to capture the shuttle. "She's in," Ron replied.
"Initiate the undercurrent. Any heading," Evie yelled.
The green wisps of the undercurrent appeared at the edges of the screen, and within seconds they had filled up the screen, and the familiar image of the undercurrent was in front of them. A sheen was present on every forehead, save for Zal. When Evie looked down, the armrests on her chair were cracked and bent in strange places, like they'd been crushed.
"Is everyone okay? Report." "We're clear," Talia said. "No pursuit."
"And Captain Geisen's shuttle is in the bay," Zal replied. "No casualties coming in." "Engineering reports the undercurrent is stable," Graydon said. "Jesus, this ship is fast." Evie nodded. They'd done it. And this time, they'd managed to survive without any casualties. There had to be something said for that, right? But when she gripped her armrest again, she found the indentations in the metal exactly matched the grip of her fingers. And that, more than anything else, unnerved her. 17. Cas slumped back against the wall, watching the circulating current run through all the conduits in perfect harmony. They'd managed to initialize the system twice now, and this time had been easier than the first, which meant they could count on the ability to activate the undercurrent whenever necessary. He'd had some concern that when they initially stopped at 5, they wouldn't be able to restart the system and would remain stuck there instead of back at the Athru planet. Though it wasn't a concern he wanted to volunteer at the time, mostly due to Evie's fragile state. Fortunately, it seemed like everyone had learned how to work together. Though he'd noticed Wolf had been late, he didn't like the idea that it took 4 people to get the thing moving. But until Sesster woke up, it was all they had. And for now, it worked. He glanced over at Zenfor, who was in the middle of monitoring her own systems, the advanced drive. Gone was the visage of hate she'd worn when encountering Samaya, instead replaced with her neutral expression. Now was as good a time as any. "Everything good?" Cas asked, walking up. If she was surprised to see him, she didn't show it. "All systems are working. Once I finally managed to get my hands on this system and redesigned it to work more efficiently, things have improved." "I need to talk to you about Samaya." Cas tried not to take a defensive posture, but he couldn't help it. "What about her?" Still the same neutral expression, as if she didn't know who they were talking about. "I know I can't formally discipline you for your actions, but you were out of line. You could have seriously hurt her." At last Zenfor turned to him, and he caught a fire in her gray eyes that hadn't been there before. "She's lucky I didn't kill her. She was on the ship that murdered Tan Sil. At least you had an excuse." Cas gritted his teeth. "Do your people have no concept of forgiveness? That was over 25 years ago, for both of you. I'm not sure you learned this about humans in all your time with us, but we can change when we want to. That mission was Samaya's breaking point. After that, she did everything she could to stop the project. Doesn't that count for anything?" "It does. It's why she's not dead at the moment." He thought he'd seen something soften in her, but it could have been nothing more than his own illusions. Or he could have been projecting onto her ever since they'd gotten back. He'd hoped 18 years would have given her some more insight. But it was possible the loss of Sesster had affected her more than he'd been willing to realize. "You're not to touch her again. This may not be my ship, but there will be no more physical altercations. You're too strong. What comes off as a slap to you could potentially kill somebody." She eyed him. "Are you saying I don't know my own strength?" "I'm saying, as acting first officer, I'm forbidding any further contact." He had no other choice. He had to put his foot down. He wanted this resolved before reporting the incident to the captain. "And if I refuse?" Zenfor asked. He'd expected a certain amount of pushback, but he couldn't ignore just how physically intimidating she was. "All I'm saying is don't put me in that position. It won't be good for either of us." She returned her attention to her equipment. "I'm done with her anyway. It would be best if we didn't cross paths again." "Sounds like a plan to me," Cas said, happy to be done with the business. "Excuse me." Cas turned to see Tyler standing off to the side, a small tablet in his hand. "I've got the updated specs for you." "There," Zenfor said, pointing to the side of the table without looking. As he set the tablet down, Cas addressed him. "How was everything holding?" "Better than expected," Tyler replied. "I mean, for only running this thing twice, I think we're doing well." His eyes flicked to the side for a microsecond, and Cas could have sworn he saw something pass between him and Zenfor, who had momentarily taken her attention off her own work. But it was gone in less than a second, and Cas couldn't swear he hadn't imagined it. After all, these two had never gotten along well. "Keep me updated. I need to go check on the shuttles." Cas left them without another word, though he kept them in his peripheral as he made his way toward the door. Tyler lingered at Zenfor's station for a moment, but he couldn't tell if any more words passed between them. But something was going on. Had he expected it had something to do with Ryan's missing time? But he could deal with that later. Now he needed to catch back up with Samaya and make sure Box hadn't steered her wrong. As he left, he could have sworn he felt Wolf's eyes burning into the back of his neck from her place up on the second level. But he didn't turn to confirm. He just kept on walking. Samaya hit the bay open button with the back of her hand. 1 second, the shuttle had been out in open space. The next, it had been careening into the bay, uncontrolled, until it slammed up against one of the walls, which bounced it toward the floor as it clipped another shuttle and skidded across the surface, where it finally came to a stop thanks to emergency force barriers inside the hangar. At some point, the negators must have lost power, because 1 minute she was sitting beside Jan at the co-pilot seat, and the next they were on the ground, while Samaya coughed up another spat of blood. A deep ache in her chest told her something was very wrong, and she hadn't even bothered rousing the rest of the people she'd rescued before staggering to the door and smashing the button. As soon as the door slid open, she tumbled out, falling the half-meter to the ground. The same young ensign who'd been helping her unload before she'd taken the shuttle ran over. "Captain!" She coughed again, except this one was much wetter and came from deep down in her lungs. "She's coughing blood." The ensign tapped his comm. "I need a medic in Bay 1, immediately." "What's going on?" Saturina's voice. It sounded farther away than it should. "She must have been injured in the wreck," the ensign replied. He was leaned over Samaya, but didn't touch her. "It was rough. We lost power on the first hit. I'll check on everyone else." The ensign leaned over. "Don't worry, Captain. We've got the best medical crew in the fleet, or what used to be the fleet. Box is great." Samaya coughed again. "You're kidding me. That thing is one of your medics?" "Doctor, actually." Box's booming voice came from the other side of the room. "And he has excellent hearing." He trotted over to Samaya. She tried to keep her expression neutral when she saw he was an ARM model and not one of the more domestic brands. Those all had humanesque faces. The ARMs had been built for combat, so just the basics: optics and a speaker under a faceplate. She'd only seen a few since the invasion, and none had been in working order. "What's she grinning at?" Box asked. "Isn't pain supposed to be painful?" I don't know. She's coughing up blood," the ensign said. That wasn't good. Other than losing her eye, she'd been lucky over the years. This might finally be the thing that did it, shut the door on the whole story. She wasn't sure she was ready yet or not, but at least some of the agony would be over. "I need to get her to sickbay," Box said. There was a slight change in the tone of his voice, which scared Samaya more than the crash itself. Within moments, she was on a portable stretcher. She hadn't seen one of these in at least 9 years. Being hovered to the ship's sickbay, Box had placed a small device on her chest, which was helping her breathe better, and she'd managed to stop coughing. Before they reached sickbay, Caspian had appeared at her side. She wasn't sure where he'd come from or when exactly he'd arrived, but he was there, saying something to Box, though the words weren't intelligible, at least not at the moment. Box pushed her into probably the nicest sickbay she'd ever seen, and she was too distracted by all the new equipment and devices to even feel herself being moved to one of the operation beds. This ship out of time was truly a wonder, and in the few moments before she succumbed to unconsciousness from whatever Box had just injected her with, she felt hope for the first time in nearly 2 decades. Mild abrasions of the lungs, liver, kidney, 2 fractured ribs, which produced a small puncture in the lung, internal bruising, and 1 fractured spinal vertebra. Which is odd, considering I just got the report from down to the bay and everyone else was fine. Box took out a tool and placed it on Samaya's unconscious head. Her injuries are consistent with blunt force trauma, though there seem to be 2 impact points. "That's because Zenfor knocked her to the ground," Cas said, watching as Box got to work on Samaya. Zax came over, both sets of her hands clasped behind her. "I was always afraid that day might come. Up until now, the only person she'd ever struck was you. But our guest here is a good deal older, in human terms. Her body is more susceptible to breaks." "Not for long," Box said. "I've been working on a new technique to increase bone density by 500%. All I need is to inject—" "Box," Zax warned. "Maybe another time. This shouldn't take very long. We'll fix all the internal bruising and the cracked rib first, then patch up the lung and repair the spine. Easy peasy." The door slid open to reveal Graydon and Evie, the former with a panicked look on his face. When he'd first met the man, Cas hadn't expected he was the type to show so much emotion. But Samaya had explained he was a very tender person. "What's going on? Is she okay?" "She will be," Box replied, "after some top-level medical care provided by yours truly. I'll have her doing somersaults in the corridors in no time." "What about everyone else?" Evie asked, coming up beside him. "Most are just malnourished," Zax said. "I've started 9 of them on supplements. The rest I checked and sent them back for their assignments." What about the viruses? Cas asked. Somaya said something about a new strain of bug. Zax held up one of her hands, palm out.
Already taken care of. I had the perfect immunization. It was nothing more than a mutation on the interspecies venenia wave that swept through the Coalition back in '87.
Our access to medicine has been limited, Graydon said, and we're still not sure the Athru aren't using biological weapons to root the rest of us out. Cas swore he saw Evie's eyes flinch at the word Athru, but even she didn't seem to notice.
Cas, I need you back in engineering to get those obfuscation units integrated and working. We can only stay on this heading for so long until they pick up our trail. And even though we're faster, there's nothing that says they can't have 1,000 ships waiting for us at our destination. Captain Geisen was right. We're too easy to find.
Evie turned to Graydon.
Would you mind helping, since you know the technology?
I'm just a soldier, Graydon replied. But I know a couple of my crew who'd be happy to help.
Great, Evie replied. Until then, we'll stay on this heading. Once we're invisible, then we can figure out our next move.
Which is what? Box asked, working on Somaya. Cas cringed. He hadn't wanted to ask in front of everyone, but apparently Box didn't have that filter. If Evie hadn't come up with a way forward yet, she'd be nothing but embarrassed.
I'm still working on that part. I think it might be a good idea to try one of the core worlds. Untu is in this general area. If the aliens are only targeting humans, they might be willing to help.
Her face was tense, as if she was coming up with a plan on the spot, which Cas assumed was the reality. They hadn't even had a chance to discuss their next moves ever since he'd brought Somaya on board. Graydon scoffed. Good luck. Everyone we've talked to says Untu has sealed themselves off. Trade routes, communication, everything. They've gone isolationist. A lot of the worlds have. Without the cooperation of the Coalition to support them, many worlds just curled back into themselves, afraid to reach out. And after seeing what the Athru can do, I don't blame them. I don't know what humans did to piss them off, but it must have been something terrible.
I refuse to believe, after 2 millennia of peaceful cooperation, the core worlds are just going to throw their hands up and say they're done with it, Evie spat.
Cas knew she was angry, but he wasn't sure Graydon was wrong. He'd seen the cracks in the Coalition long before Evie had. Maybe they had been too deep to resolve after all. Trust me, we went through this with Yaxinax 12 years ago. Cas noticed Zax perk up. No offense, Doctor, but your people wanted nothing to do with us. Zax frowned.
That doesn't sound like my people. After the founding of the Coalition, we were happy to interact and share with other cultures. Our primary goal was to fill our libraries with as much information as possible. We can't do that if we cut ourselves off from the rest of the galaxy.
Graydon put his hands up. I'm just telling you what we went through. They wouldn't even let us get close to the planet.
Let's see if Untu is more welcoming, Evie said. Perhaps the appearance of a Coalition starship will change their minds, remind them of what they used to be a part of.
Her nostrils flaring, Evie turned and headed for the door. Cas didn't like she was so worked up. Would all this stress affect the blocked memories? He tried to catch Box's attention, but he was too focused, and there were too many other people around. Perhaps it was better if he began his work on the obfuscator. At least it would keep his mind off that little box in the back of his mind that was beginning to rattle with rage. 18. Insanity. Pure insanity. There was no way the Coalition had just folded and the core worlds had abandoned humanity. Evie refused to believe it. Sure, an invading force would be disruptive, and in the case of the Athru, downright catastrophic. But that didn't mean they could tear apart 2,000 years of cooperation, integration, and sharing, did it? What about all the blended families all over the Coalition? What about the humans who lived on Yaxinax and Untu and 100 other non-native worlds? Had they been excised like a broken power rod? And what of all the species living on Earth and other human worlds? Had the Athru left them to live? Or was that part of the reason the other planets no longer wanted to help them? Their people had been slaughtered for the crime of being close to humans? She stopped in the hall and leaned up against the cool bulkhead, closing her eyes. People passed, but no one was stupid enough to stop and ask her what was wrong. Not that she could have told them if she wanted to.
Captain?
Shit. She spoke too soon. Evie plastered a smile on her face and turned to see no one. The corridor was empty, despite the fact she'd seen members of the crew walking around before. What the... Evie spun in a circle, making sure someone wasn't playing a trick on her. But there was nowhere to hide. She was alone. She tapped the comm at the back of her hand.
Bridge? Did someone call me?
Checking the logs, Saul replied. Nothing on the ship's record since before you left the bridge. Are you experiencing a malfunction?
I don't know,
Evie replied, still eyeing the corridor. She had a sudden need for her sword.
I'll call you back.
She ended the transmission. This was not happening. She was not going to fall into these hallucinations again, not after all the trouble she'd gone to rid herself of them. And this time, Sesster wasn't around to help in the event she got into trouble. Not that it was going to happen anyway.
Seems you've forgotten someone.
The voice came from all around her, and Evie spun again, sure she would catch the culprit. But it was just her.
What the fuck?
She whispered. Her heart pounded in her chest as she jerked her head left and right, trying to find the owner of the voice. She'd heard it before, somewhere. It was a woman's voice.
You've definitely heard it before. Only then things were different. Then you were complete.
The voice had a playfulness to it. Someone was toying with her.
Just tell me what you want,
she yelled, furious she didn't know who this person was or what they wanted, or if they were even real.
I'm real, all right, they said, as real as you.
Are you a mind reader now? Evie asked.
Why don't you show your face? Or are you too much of a coward to face me in person?
Her anxiety had been ratcheted up to 11. Was she arguing with someone else, or just her own mind? Unless Tempest had become haunted in the past 18 years, in which case, finding out this was some sort of non-corporeal being would make her feel a lot better.
I am facing you. You just don't realize it.
What sort of double talk was that? Whether it was her mind playing games with her or someone else, Evie didn't have time for this. She had a ship to run and a crew to think about. They could very well be the last crew in the entire coalition, and it was her duty to find them a safe haven, at least until she could figure out their next steps. She rubbed her forehead. Maybe she should head back to sickbay for some relief.
Giving up too soon. They did a number on you, all right.
Evie turned and headed back the way she came. Maybe if she stopped responding, the voice would go away. All she was doing by speaking was encouraging it.
Oh, they tried to make me go away once before. It didn't work so well. Shut up! Just shut up already, she yelled, just as a crewman turned the corner.
He stopped in his tracks, staring at her. Evie huffed and turned the other way again, heading back down for her original destination. Where had she been going again? The bridge?
You're a lot stronger than I first gave you credit for. Humans shouldn't be able to do what you did. But then again, you're not exactly human, are you?
Evie furrowed her brow and continued walking.
Just ignore it. It will all go away. Let's see just how strong you are. And since you seem so intent on remaining ignorant in your own human way, I'll give you a hint. And it's just one word.
Gritting her teeth, she suppressed a response and kept on walking. The hypervator wasn't far away. All she needed to do was get back up to the bridge, get this mission back on track.
Esturva,
the voice whispered, and Evie jumped. It felt as if the person's lips, if you could call them a person, had been right on her ear. But of course, when she looked, there was no one close. Just a maintenance team further on down the corridor working on some repairs.
Is that all? She whispered. A nonsensical word? What does it mean?
Silence. Typical. Now that she wanted to know more, the voice suddenly had another appointment? She didn't care if it was just a non-corporeal being or just the fracturing of her own mind. She didn't like being ambushed like this. Something was wrong with her. She hadn't been the same ever since coming up from the surface, and no matter how many times she tried to explain it away, it never quite made sense. She considered talking to Dr. Zax about it, but Zax had the power to render her unfit for the job, and in the middle of this crisis, that was the worst thing that could happen. The crew knew the basics, but they didn't know all the details Geisen and the others had disseminated, at least not yet. With the two crews mixing, it wouldn't be long before everyone knew the full gravity of the situation. This was no time for Evie to be out of commission. The hypervator arrived, and she stepped aboard, trying to put the whole experience behind her. But the very last word hung in her mind like a cobweb above her reach, staring down at her. Esturva.
There. Now, I suggest you take a trip to our mess hall and have a good meal. I've given you a few inhibitors, so your body won't reject all the solid food.
Zax replaced the auto-inhibitor in its slot on the sterile tray and stepped back from the young man. He was probably no more than 15 in human years, his mother standing close by. From the looks on their faces, it had either been a very long time since they'd seen a Yaxinax, or they never had the pleasure. Not that it bothered her. Yaxinax often had the same reactions to seeing humans for the first time.
Thanks,
the boy said, rubbing his arm. Zax addressed the mother.
Make sure both of you get at least 2 good meals today. We have plenty on board, so don't feel as if you need to ration yourselves. The idea is to get better.
The mother nodded.
Thanks for all your help. I'm not sure what we would have done. It wasn't anything serious, but you would have endured a few more weeks of unnecessary suffering.
She replaced the tray of tools into its container where they would receive another round of sterilization treatments. The boy and his mother had come in malnourished, and both with slight fevers. Like most of the people from the station, they were lacking in basic nutrients. A lot of the food had been saved for the soldiers, as they expended more energy patrolling and keeping the rest safe. Zax didn't necessarily agree with it, but she understood the logic behind the plan. After she pointed them in the direction of the mess hall, Zax returned to Box, double-checking his progress on Captain Geisen and finding he was doing an excellent job repairing all her injuries. He moved with a precision no organic being could hope to match, which gave him an edge in time-sensitive surgeries, and it was the reason he made such a good healer. "A couple more hours, and she'll be good to go," Box said, not looking up as he continued to work. Zax nodded, lingering near the bed. She wasn't sure she wanted to ask what had been on her mind the past few days, but at the same time, she wasn't sure she could let it go. As the ship's primary physician, she was responsible for not only the crew's physical health, but their mental as well. And as far as she had seen, there was one member of the crew who was exhibiting some strange behavior after their time at the planet.
Box, can you concentrate on Captain Geisen's care and answer a question for me at the same time?
Somewhere deep inside him, a sound blurted out. She would have described it as a half-laugh, half-dismissal.
Of course. Ask away. I could be doing 4 other things right now if I had as many hands.
She wasn't sure if that was a veiled remark at her or not. It was so hard to tell with him sometimes.
What happened before you woke up Captain Diazol?
It was brief, almost imperceptible, but one of his hands hesitated just a fraction of a second before resuming what he'd been doing. From a young age, Yaxinax were taught to use the full range of their ocular abilities, which included the perception of micro-movements. Zax herself put this to good use when she was inspecting a patient's body for irregularities, such as in the heart or arteries. But it came in useful other times as well.
She was unconscious. I kept her in that state because of her infection. I reviewed the logs and her personal data. I didn't see any indication of any infection. How did you diagnose it?
He was silent a moment, the small click-click of his mechanical fingers the only sound in the room.
Observation, he finally said. And it wasn't in the medical record. Something completely new?
Yep. She nodded, playing along.
I've noticed you haven't written a detailed report on it yet, despite the fact it's been over a week. I'd like to learn more about this condition so we can keep a lookout for it in the future.
She'd suspected from day one that something wasn't right when she'd spoken to the captain, and she'd shown absolutely no remorse for the loss of the crew on the planet. The captain was a very empathetic person, and Zax remembered just how much Captain Green's death had affected her. She'd suspected Diazol had been close with Lieutenant Yamashita, despite their attempts to keep it quiet. It wasn't as if she was about to announce to the ship what the lieutenant had done for Diazol when she'd been incapacitated in sickbay. And it was true. There were people who could hold their composure much better than others, but the captain tended to wear her heart on her sleeve, as the humans said, and it often wasn't hard to decipher what she was thinking. But since they'd come back, she'd shown zero remorse for someone who had once been very close to her, and Zax suspected she knew why. I would like to, but I've been busy with my experiments. I will work on it today, after I finish with the captain here.
Box,
Zax leaned over the table.
I know you use the encephalographic equipment on the captain to modify her memories. What I want to know is why.
Box stopped working. I am appalled and insulted. She cut her eyes to him.
Box,
to think that I, a certified medical professional of the United Coalition of Aligned Systems, would voluntarily perform a procedure to the detriment of a patient is frankly ridiculous, and I won't stand here and—
Box, you are a terrible liar. Has anyone ever told you that?
His eyes blinked in rapid succession. It may have come up once or twice. Zax drew a deep breath.
I'm not saying you did it to her detriment. I don't believe you would have done that. Obviously, you thought it was beneficial. What I want to know is why. What happened down on that planet?
If I tell you, the information stays in here. He looked around.
Cas says, if it gets out, it could be catastrophic.
Zax's eyes widened. She'd suspected Caspian had something to do with it, and now she had confirmation. But she also knew the value of wanting to keep something private, especially if the consequences of revealing such a secret could have repercussions for more than just one person. She nodded.
I promise. Now, start from the beginning.